Hello.
Welcome back for another episode of the Future Fossils podcast. I'm Michael Garfield.
And I am Evan Snyder, and we are hanging out today talking about time and its effect on us and our place in it.
Yeah, well, this time it seems our first podcast focused more on the geometry and the geography of time, very big abstract stuff, but the unrecorded early part of this conversation, Evan and I were mostly talking about winter and how we're both winter babies and how the evidence seems to be compiling that whether or not the vast, broader arches and arguments and assertions of astrology are accurate, that there are, in fact, measurable hormonal balances that differ from children born in different seasons. And so, a winter baby is somebody that had to survive a pregnancy through different seasons than a summer baby. And, historically, there are, there are these similarities between children that are born in the months where the sunlight is very dim and the hours of the sun are few. And yet, here we are in a society that has forgotten about the quality or the Kairos of time, has forgotten that each moment is not identical to every other moment, and that we tend to worship the chronos, or just rather the measured passage of time. And in so doing, we lose this a full half of the information of our experience. And so we end up in this society where we have pathologized sadness and introspection and, this sort of thoughtful, curious, but somewhat morose personality type.
Let's see, hyperactivity, for example. Depression, anxiety, insomnia, OCD, in a way for me are unchanneled amounts of energy present in many people that could actually be used to great benefit.
Yeah, that's the Sir Ken Robinson TED Talk on the educational system and how broken it is because it forces every child to stay seated, and how they know through psychological experiments that people that are required to keep their hands still on the table perform poorly at mathematical tasks compared to people that are allowed to move and, whether they're even aware of it or not, count on their fingers or, do this sort of fully embodied calculation. And that's, so this is what happens. We pose a real threat to our complete being by ignoring what we could learn from allowing different times of the annual ring, the movement of seasons, but then also there's the lunar cycle nested within that 13 moon year, where every week, Douglas Rushkoff talks about this in his book Present Shock, which for those of you interested in time is a fantastic, highly recommended book. And he mentions how while he was researching it, he found that the lunar month moves through 4 weeks, each of which has a surge of a particular neurotransmitter. So 1 week of the month is serotonin, 1 week is norepinephrine, 1 week is dopamine, and 1 week is acetylcholine. And these 4 weeks of the month lead to 4 very different types of behavior. Or you can actually feel in the balsamic moon, the moon, the week right before it goes completely black.
Yeah.
That there's this sort of introspective inward, it's like the lunar winter, and that that annual seasonal ring is recapitulated in the microcosm of the monthly lunar ring, and that this same spring-like energy of like growing momentum emerges in the waxing moon, and then it reaches this peak that's like the peak of summer. All of these things are true across scales, and like by understanding this cycle, he was able to limit his writing to 1 week a month, but increase his word count by 40%, because he was actually surfing across the wave rather than against it.
Yeah. In the future, I think any like truly balanced workplace should afford women the opportunity to not only sit out their time of the month, but meditate upon it, reflect upon it, draw influence, draw introspection and ideas from that experience, because it seems to me to be something somewhat holy, and to be perfectly honest, outside of the pain and the other things I can't possibly imagine as a guy, I'm kind of jealous of, because I have my own lunar cycle, but it's somewhat, subtle and not that cool. The women have a more badass relationship to the moon, and I try to respect that where I can, and I feel like honestly women deserve the opportunity to have control over that stuff.
Well, actually, there's a very poorly researched, poorly understood male hormonal cycle. I think there was something recently published about it in Popular Science. Testosterone levels peak dramatically on day 18 of a 30-day cycle. And I've heard elsewhere that there's a 72-day cycle that's associated with the cycles of solar magnetic activity, which is not really all that surprising, because there was a researcher in Australia about 10 years ago, recorded several hundred dreams over a few years, and then correlated them with the geomagnetic activity in Perth, where he was living, and found that there was a reliable inverse correlation between the strength of the magnetic field and the bizarreness of his dreams, which if you think about it, it's like the weaker the magnetic grid that's sort of like locking us into consensus experience, the more wild our imaginative roamings become. Or like a better way of saying this might be, there's more cosmic radiation striking his dreaming brain and leading to bizarre random firings when the magnetic field around him is lower and is deflecting less of that radiation. So like all of these things are there, and the tide affects all coral, all sea critters, male or female.
Like estuaries and shallow bays, etc. They're deeply affected by the moon, from one 30-day period and 4-week period, and the even torque in the tectonic plates. This is the same thing as what happened with the ice ages, when there were massive amounts of ice, water ice, and glaciers on the surface of the Earth, changing the stress and strain and actually topography of the tectonic plates. The same does occur to some, albeit somewhat minor degree, with the moon and the tidal cycle.
Yeah, and then it's. I think that there's a kind of demand that's being made on us, the more we learn about these things, to recognize that not only, like in Douglas Rushkoff's case, can we be more productive members of society if we take these things into consideration, but that we may actually be able to live healthier, more vibrant, more beautiful, more creative lives, and that if we take all of these various cycles into consideration, I mean, really our society, modern society, is a totally aberrant mode of human culture historically, because we're like Western modern humans are pretty much the only society that hasn't been completely obsessed with these greater cycles and understanding, conferring meaning onto the individual life by posing it within this larger shifting, dynamic phenomenon that is the literal reality of our being in a dynamic space. It seems like there's this sort of weird confluence, unfortunate confluence of the demands that are being made on our attention and our ability to even notice these things in a way that would empower us to be more co-creative and participatory in these cycles. That there's like historically there's kind of a masculine version of the magical traditions and a feminine version, kind of reflecting what you were saying earlier about red magic and the menstrual cycle, that women in general throughout history have taken a more their magic tends to express itself as alignment with these cycles, and men tend to look at it as well, how can my knowledge of these cycles increase my power so that I can transcend their hold on me? But like maybe we're being called in this age to integrate both of those modes and like recognize how these two ways of seeing the world are actually going to live together, taking the biggest possible perspective that we can on the situation.
Yeah, and actually that brings me to sort of the side topic, or maybe even the main topic for today's conversation, which I hope you don't mind, is Star Wars, is the new incarnation of The Force Awakens, because...
No, not Star Wars.
Oh, yeah, we're doing it. It's my birthday week. I get to make the calls. Your birthday week just passed, so we'll take it there for a little bit. We can bring it back if you need. But I did want to say, because of the Neil Gaiman seminar video that you sent me, and we'll link to for the Long Now Foundation, that there were some dramatic parallels between his presentation, his speech, and where The Force Awakens was taken, and also with reflection of what you just mentioned with respect to like the feminine, the masculine, the retelling of the great story, the hero's journey, which is not necessarily one or the other, male or female. It is a universal tale, and the way it's being represented now. So I'll let you interject for a second, and if you don't mind, we'll get back to that for at least a short bit, because I am very interested to talk about it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Just to clarify, folks, Evan has expressed his fondness for homework and preparation, so I sent him a 2-hour lecture to watch today before we started our talk, and this lecture is superb. It's the author, Neil Gaiman, author of Sandman and American Gods, and co-author of Good Omens and
Coraline as well. Stardust is now available in movie form, starring Robert De Niro and Claire Danes on Netflix.
Yeah, super great.
We're not working for them, by the way. I just remember.
So Neil Gaiman, who is this exemplary living legend, modern storyteller, gave a talk at the Long Now Foundation in California, which is dedicated to enculturating a long view in people, to like encouraging people to take not just a 7-generational perspective, but they actually started adding a 0 to the beginning of all of their year dates. So this year is 02016.
Yep.
Because little tweaks like that, little perceptual hacks, enable us, or rather, guide us into taking a very long perspective on our actions and their influence on future unborn generations. Super great. They've got an amazing plenary presentation series that you can watch on longnow.org. And Neil Gaiman's talk was on how to make stories that last. The critical example in his case, in his talk, was the panel that the United States government assembled to, or rather sort of like an interdisciplinary think tank, I guess, to figure out how to properly mark our nuclear waste disposal sites so that in 10,000 years, when the writing has changed, when America has been forgotten and all trace of it has been lost, and he makes the point that basically nothing that we consider bad or a warning within the framework of our current system would qualify. Like that, even a skull, or to say that something is toxic. The way that our slang mutates so rapidly. So he actually suggested, or rather, one of the people in this research group suggested that perhaps the best way to make information carried through the generations is through the creation of ritual and myth, and basically to found a religion. And found a religion that doesn't even necessarily have to be about atomic waste and avoiding a particular area, but which will still nonetheless pass on an emotional charge through generations that would keep people away from this site. Perhaps a story of how dangerous it was, but that story will grow and adapt and evolve to suit the changing climate of the time, and the power of belief and ritual will sort of hold it in place. And so really,
exactly.
This is totally what George Lucas is doing, and I'll let you take it from here because I have no idea what you're about to say.
Right on. Well, not so much again what George Lucas is doing, but what he has done, what he started. He is in a way the echo of Darth Vader, that Kylo Ren and J.J. Abrams are continuing and going to finish what he started, so to speak. I love the idea of our modern mythology being now a multi-generational story where, the passing of David Bowie as of a few days ago, rest in peace, Mr. Starman, is now a multi-generational celebration of a person's life. And Star Wars has become, in some ways now, a third generational story, where there are a lot of people that still care a lot, actually, about the prequels, believe it or not, as shoddy as it may have been in some ways, that actually deeply identify with them. And I know we may laugh at that, because we're 80s babies, and we fell in love with the original trilogy first and foremost, but I understand how, in some ways, the prequels continue that inspiration of incredible imagination and bizarre storytelling and surprises and things you didn't expect, could make people have a conflicting sense of the new trilogy, which is starting now with The Force Awakens, with J.J. Abrams, and being continued forward with Rian Johnson, who did Looper and episodes of Breaking Bad. And then from there with Colin Trevorrow, who did Jurassic World, which you and I could talk about again at length with as well. Yes, I know.
Yeah. Less excited about that one than Rian Johnson, let me tell you.
Yes, but think about Return of the Jedi. It was, in retrospect, a fun romp, just like A New Hope was. The core, like with most of us, like with most of my friends, like with you, with my closest companions, my girlfriend, my family, I want to know the core of them. And if you look at a trilogy, like the core is the second episode. It's like when you look at a trilogy of albums, for example, like the first three that any producer or band will release, the second one, the sophomore album, is like kind of it's always a pressure to take it on what happened, but also truly do something new and do something unique. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunity going forward. But I do want to relate, before we go past The Force Awakens, the parallels between what Neil Gaiman said about the quintessential archetype of the fall into the fire, into the volcano, as Luke himself fell into the pit in Empire Strikes Back, as the Emperor fell in Return of the Jedi, and as Darth Maul fell in Phantom Menace. The fall of Han Solo into the pit of a planet which, although it may have seemed a direct copy of A New Hope, that planet was not destroyed. It turned into a star. It turned into a sun at the end, which I know is one of your favorite topics in terms of astrophysical phenomena. So I'll let you take it from that point.
That is an interesting point of consideration, that we are... It echoes for me the Arthur C. Clarke theme throughout his 2001 series into 2010 and 2061. 2010, which was adapted to film, very strange, very, very different from the original Stanley Kubrick adaptation to screen, which understandably, because it was 2010 was adapted from a book, whereas 2001 was written, the film and the book were written in tandem with each other.
Yeah.
So
parallel.
But there's this theme in there where this mysterious alien intelligence that has left us the monolith is also engineering changes in our solar system elsewhere, that they're not just engineering changes in the human being, but in our planets.
Yeah.
And so at the very end of 2010, and it becomes the central matter of 2061, Jupiter is engineered to collapse on itself and form a star.
A new sun in the solar system. So we have two.
And so there's, you might say that archetypally or symbolically, that even though Han Solo was not force sensitive or enabled enough to form a blue ghost, or at least he probably we're not probably going to get a blue ghost Han Solo in future installments.
What if we do? Like Han Solo, I guess Harrison Ford has been commissioned to come back for Episode 8. He is clearly dead, so the possibilities are A, he comes back as a hologram, B, as a Force vision, or C, as a Force ghost.
And what are the differences there exactly? Yeah. Anyway,
right.
But so this shimmery blue ghost thing that persists after the person has died. That we witnessed this with Dave Bowman, the astronaut that makes it through the monolith in 2001.
Right.
and appears to people as sort of an apparition, helping assure them that the bizarre changes our solar system are undergoing are going to result in something beautiful.
Kubrick and Clark were extremely detail-oriented. Think about the name Dave Bowman. And who recently died? The Starman himself, David Bowie. That was not inconsequential. I guarantee if you were to ask Kubrick today if he were still alive, you would find that tidbit. And then there have been a lot of breadcrumbs leading in that direction, that he was a metaphor for David Bowie as the Starman, as the character of that person.
And then, I don't know if you ever actually watched this, but I interviewed the historian William Irwin Thompson a couple times, and in our first interview in December 2011, which we will post a link to if we can remember to do so.
Sure.
He actually rapped at length about 2001 as an encoding of information on esoteric initiation, and said if you look at the craft, the ship that they used to venture out there, that it is essentially a human spinal cord, like a nervous system. The head, the control booth is in the front, and then it proceeds down this sort of spinal array to the very end.
Yeah.
And that the conflict between Hal and Dave Bowman is the conflict between the transcendental potential of humankind and this sort of this survival urge out of which proliferates the entire military-industrial complex and all of our war and conflict. And that there's this, that especially poignant moment where Hal starts to glitch as he's being systematically shut down is this really beautiful instance where we're being invited into a moment of empathy for the machine that all of us are, for this survival drive that each of us possess, that is actually in this world, and with respect to the way that it keeps us from transcending ourselves, which is inherently dangerous to the ego and the idea of the separate self. That there's this moment of compassion for this thing that is unable to see over the hill, as it were, is unable to understand the greater mission, and regards the fulfillment of that mission as a threat. But at any rate, there is something cool going on there about. It's almost like Han Solo sort of inseminates the military-industrial egg of the of the Star Killer base, and then we have this luminous apotheosis at the end, where, of course, like, even if maybe the energy of that explosion is enough to propel him into Blue Ghost status.
It might be. Well, see, the thing is, like, again, it's known as Star Killer Base. But at the end of the film, it itself collapses into a star. It is a star birth. It is the opposite of what it was meant to be. And if you see at that scene where, again, spoiler alert, and we should probably put this at the beginning of the episode, Han Solo dies in The Force Awakens, that at that moment in time, as a reflection of both the motifs in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi and a lot of well-known film, the lighting actually reflects the characters. And if you watch Kylo Ren's or Ben Solo's face during the opening of that sequence of him on the bridge with his father Han Solo, he is mostly bathed in natural light, which has been brought in by Rey, the ray of light walking in and opening the door and revealing the light of the dying star on his face. And it's only at the moment of the star totally fading and having its energy absorbed 100%, 110%, whatever it might be, by Starkiller, that Kylo Ren changes his mind. And he realizes that his father is there to help him choose the dark side and not the light, and murders his father to propel him towards Snoke and towards the dark side, towards Mustafar and the Empire of yore, towards his grandfather Darth Vader.
But there's a really cool thing going on in this series, which I admire, especially in light of, as strange as this might sound, in light of the advertising campaign that came out around this film.
Yeah.
So there was this thing that they started doing for this film where it was, and this, I can get cynical about this and say that this is, just marketing psychology and that they're just manipulating people. But at the same time, a lot of the advertising surrounded this choice where various partners and retailers were offering people an identity decision. Are you gonna partner with the light side or the dark side? Which side are you? And so they might offer, like chocolate and vanilla or whatever. It's like, it's kind of lame on that level. But there's this other level where in 1977, there would not have been a chance in hell that they would have said to the audience, so hey, do you identify with Darth Vader? Do you sympathize with the anti-hero? And so in a way, the cultural response around this film reflects the actual moral development, the increasing moral complexity that we're being led into by these filmmakers, where the prequels, which I love, at least in theory.
Right.
I was super obsessed with the whole notion of Anakin Skywalker and like what would turn a person to the dark side. They give us this opportunity to see that like bringing balance to the Force does not mean, wiping out one side of the equation to make the light side in all of its sort of liberal fascist elitist weirdness, as it existed, as the Jedi existed at the very end of that Republic. It was about leveling the playing field, right? So
yeah, Michael can tell by my emphatic gesturing via webcam that I really want to talk on this. So Darth Vader is known as in a way the chosen one, or that person that will bring balance to the Force. So it was taken as maybe a single generation as him embodying that in particular, but it might actually be that the split between dark and light is some aspect with balance in both. The idea of Gemini, say in the astrological chart, where you have the twins, but those twins are also twins. It's a dark and a light in both sides of the twin coin.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this gets back to the beginning of our conversation when we're talking about the cultural rejection of winter and of sadness.
Yes.
And generally of darkness, that we've come to associate darkness with evil due to, a number of embodied metaphorical entailments, that it's harder to grow food. And so naturally over thousands of generations, we respond to this spitefully. We're like, winter, shaking our fists.
Icy bastard.
Right, but winter is, even if you're not a Capricorn like Evan and I, winter is in us. It's in all of us. Even if you live at the equator, there are, these little cycles, and it's like, it's the rejection of death, the rejection of aging, the rejection of the feminine, the rejection of the material world and of the body, and of responsibility. And in a way, I see us. It's not a surprise to me that here we are talking about the growing emphasis that our culture has put on moral ambiguity in storytelling, because really this whole podcast, as I kind of imagine it,
sure,
is about the reconciliation of the light and dark within us as the only sustainable strategy moving quote unquote forward.
Sure. So the idea of the Grey Jedi is much of the same, in that our mantle of Team America World Police has in a way catalyzed the generation and the development and spread of ISIS. That perhaps the only way towards world peace is in fact towards a moral gray area where there is not so much judgment, there is not so much like a determination and a militaristic response and reflection towards certain perspectives, that there is a great deal more tolerance and acceptance, which if you look at the spread of a lot of these more totalitarian, terroristic, jihadist in the Muslim sense regimes, and I'm talking again a tiny percentage of Muslims, and in fact a tiny percentage of just religious people, and in fact people as a whole, They are just a subset of all of us, and representative of the downtrodden and the people who don't have other opportunities. And there are a lot more of those people than those who are in ISIS. There are a lot of human, spirits and experiences across the globe. There are a lot more Americans than there are in ISIS, I think, who are struggling right now with the idea of the American dream. Whether or not they can succeed, if they can pay their way for their families, for their loved ones, for their friends, and have a reasonable and honorable existence.
Yeah, I don't know anyone that's not struggling with that question, honestly. Even those of us who are the most well-off that I know in my life, the people that are themselves more or less insulated from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, are nonetheless concerned about their families and their communities, and aware that a new level of collective effort has to emerge, and in so doing, in the process of this, in order to work together, we have to disabuse ourselves of this notion that we've been carrying around for probably 1,000,000 years, which is that the other is bad, and really understand the other as some aspect of self, and so again back to Kylo Ren, my problem, oddly enough, I'm curious what you think about this.
Sure.
In light of these matters, my problem with Kylo Ren was actually, and this may speak to my sort of generational disposition, was not that he is a villain, but that he's sort of an incomplete or immature villain. That he's not evil enough, that he's essentially a copycat killer, and kind of like whether or not he's able to save the ones he loves or any of these sort of things. But there's sort of this cloud of mystique around what exact value he actually finds in the life of Darth Vader, but nonetheless he's just trying to follow in somebody's footsteps, and that sort of makes him innately underwhelming. And I wanted somebody who was really and truly and coolly and brilliantly mean, who was, because when the lightsaber finally goes through Han Solo, you're like, after all of that, really, after he defeated all of these amazing foes and survived all these epic adventures, it was so anticlimactic. And I found myself just being mad that I didn't have the luxury of the great villain foil.
Kylo or Ben Solo is my favorite character by far, in significant part for the exact reason that you cited as a weakness. That our generation especially, and this is one of the reasons why George Lucas has now been famously quoted as saying, that The Force Awakens is a nostalgic movie. It's a throwback, The idea of the villain as not totally black and white is somewhat parallel to our position now as now young professionals, young Americans. We are now both progressing into our 2016 from the starting point of 1984. In kind of like a contextual relation to George Orwell's interpretation, it is not as simple as it being entirely dystopian or utopian, and we now live in the midst of a interesting gray area between the two. That America itself, a lot of us are employed in 9 to 5, 40-hour plus weeks at a employer of a particular professional outlet or another. And a lot of us want to find a moral service to our fellow people and to our world. It is a deep question, and in fact, if you look at the data, I believe our generation and younger have been shown to have a more conflicted moral set of questions with respect to our employment and our profession, our movement forward, and our economy than our parents or grandparents, etc. In part because we have to, and that's part of why the new Star Wars, I think, is significant, because we are gray also.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons that we're going to take a step sideways, because it's almost impossible to bring up Star Wars in 2001 without bringing up Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Yeah, this issue of, that's a story from a different age.
Right.
And there's a story where you have someone who Gandalf, who existed for, this unthinkably long time as the Grey, and is finally, in his conflict with darkness, sort of polarized or militarized into Gandalf the White, that we regard this as this, in the society in which this story was told, this seems like an upgrade, but in some respects, it's actually like an epigenetic adaptation to an especially desperate situation. That he has the luxury of that grayness, of that moral ambiguity, and then as soon as the darker the shadow, the brighter the light required to penetrate it. There's that kind of a thing going on where he's forced to take a side, and that again that sort of plays itself out in the Star Wars marketing. Take a side, but it's also in a way it feels like that is in some sense falling behind us, or at least I hope that we're in an age now where the complexity of the age requires a more honest acknowledgement of our complexity as quote-unquote individuals, rather than requiring us to step to one side of a dividing line and identify as only one self or another self.
Right.
I'd rather be Gandalf the Grey than Gandalf the White, because there's more creative freedom, there's more opportunity, and therefore you're capable of doing more good in some sense.
I feel a parallel with this because my grandfather was the chief of security for the Apollo program at NASA. So he worked personally with Werner von Braun, with Buzz Aldrin. I still have all of his NASA badges. He worked there for over 25 years. I have documents from NASA signed by the chief of NASA. And I look up to him a lot.
Your middle name is redacted, if I recall.
To some extent, yes. But my grandfather was way into guns, way into security, way into aliens and space. He is my Darth Vader, between the dark and the light. Between my hippie parents and my uber industrial military complex NASA grandpa. Because they pulled off some amazing shit. I believe we went to the moon, in part because I'm highly biased from my family experience. But dang, dude, it's a weird parallel to my own life, and I feel like a lot of people have that feeling to Star Wars and to a lot of modern stories, including Mad Max.
Yeah, I think there's the thread that I'm starting to identify here is that there's this thread that a devil is an angel denied. And I think this was like a Joseph Campbell thing, that this was a line that he ran on, and maybe I can find the original quote here. But this idea that when it has to do with the relationship between pain and pleasure, and that intensity, when we accept it, when we embrace it, becomes pleasure, but when we reject it, it becomes suffering, and that. It would make sense, your hypothesis of Kylo Ren's falling out with the Jedi Academy and Luke Skywalker would make sense in light of the notion that it kind of gets back to this thing about Hitler being denied from art school. Like, would we have had a Second World War if Hitler had been encouraged as an artist? So actually, here it is. I found the Joseph Campbell quote. It's from An Open Life. It was actually just tweeted to me the other day.
Nice.
by Michael Phillip at the Midwest Real podcast, which is another fabulous podcast. My definition of a devil is a god who has not been recognized. That is to say, it is a power in you to which you have not given expression, and you push it back. And then, like all repressed energy, it builds up and becomes completely dangerous to the position you're trying to hold. And then this is where we are in society. We are Kylo Ren. He's denying, and he may kind of be the opposite side of the fence. He's denying his innate potential for good. He actually regards it as a weakness and like a virus that he's trying to extricate from his system. But whichever side you pick, you're going to end up standing with one leg on the cliff and the other leg hanging over the ravines. The return of the Black Madonna, a sign of our times, or how the Black Madonna is shaking us up for the 21st century. This is by Matthew Fox. We'll post a link to it. One of the best articles I've read on this issue, on this situation of what we stand to reclaim by retrieving culturally and personally all of that which we have denied into our complete being, and how this is a necessary thing. Like, this is, as far as I have no doubt that we're going to continue to get like super out there and abstract and ethereal in these conversations.
Oh yeah.
But when it comes to the matter of what it is that we can offer the unborn generations, to me it seems like this holistic view that accepts both the angelic potential and the animal reality of the human being.
Got a lot more to learn. The work is not done here, and we may not ever figure it out. We probably won't figure it out.